All right, guys, in this video, we're going to look at population ecology. So if we think of biology as kind of a field where we can kind of start small and work big, start with the organisms, and then we hit populations, and then later we're going to talk about community ecology, we'll talk about ecosystems, and the biosphere as well. So life takes place in populations. Remember, population is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area at the same time. So population ecology looks at the question, what factors affect a population? Do they rely on the same resources? Do they interact? Do they interbreed? Those are kinds of questions we're looking at. So what is the scientific goal? Well, the scientific goal is to understand the factors that influence the size of populations. What are the general principles there? The specific cases that show us those general principles. The practical goals are management of populations. How do we manage, how do we increase population size for those populations that are very small, for those endangered species and things like that? How do we decrease population size for those that are out of control, like pests, like non-native species, things like that? And how do we maintain population size for those healthy populations, managing fisheries and things like that? So what are the factors that affect population size? So there are abiotic, the non-living factors, things like sunlight and temperature, precipitation, water availability, the types of soil, the nutrients that are available. And then there are those biotic factors, the other living organisms that live in the same place as that population. Maybe prey, if they're a predator, maybe competitors, predators, parasites, disease, things that would limit the population size. And then there are intrinsic factors. What are the adaptations they have that allow them to live in that place? So how do we characterize a population? How do we describe a population? We talk about its range, the pattern of spacing, which is like density, and the size of the population. How big is it? So the range are the geographical limitations due to the abiotic and biotic factors. Things like temperature, rainfall, food, predators can all limit where a population can live. It's basically, we're talking about its habitat. Is it adapted to a polar biome like the polar bear, or is it adapted better to a rainforest like the parrots? So throughout history, ranges can change. They can expand when maybe there's a mass extinction. They can contract due to a variety of things, climate change, human activity, loss of habitat, all those things. And you can see in the graph here, as you go up the side of the mountain, how this has changed. This is the result of competition. Grasses and chaparral were very far down this. You kind of see how it's kind of changed a little bit in the last 15,000 years. So one of the things we study a lot are at-risk populations, endangered species. What are the places that species are at risk? And one of those places is Madagascar. Almost every species on Madagascar is at risk today. But you can see a few examples here. What are the things that limit their range or maybe make their habitat smaller from habitat loss, things like that? Population spacing or dispersal patterns, there's three kinds. There's clumped, random, and uniform. They tell us a little bit about the kinds of interactions they have with other members of the population. Clumped is the most common. They tend to be clumped around resources, around available water, around breeding sites, whatever it is that population needs. Typically, the resources are not evenly spread through the habitat. So they're going to be clumped where those resources are readily available. You can see some examples here in the pictures. Uniform, this is pretty rare, but it does in places where maybe there's a lot of competition, like with nesting sites. Territoriality can lead to uniform population distribution. So how do we measure density? It's difficult to count moving targets. You can't count every individual, but you can do sampling. You can use things like mark and recapture methods and other methods, counting quadrants for things like plants and things. So you're trying to find how many individuals live in a certain area of their habitat. Now, how big that area depends on what kinds of living things you're talking about. And then finally, population size. How big is the population? Obviously, adding or removing individuals from the population is going to change the population size. You can add through births, you can remove through deaths, immigration, individuals moving in, emigration, moving out. So those 4 factors affect population size. We can also look at the growth rate. How fast is the population increasing or decreasing in size? It's affected by things like the sex ratio. How many females to males? If you have lots of males but not many females, the population's not going to grow very quickly because the females have the babies. Generation time. How long does it take for a female before she can reproduce? When do they reach reproductive maturity? And age structure. How many females are in the reproductive age in that population? You basically have 3 ranges. You have pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive. So demography studies factors that affect the growth and decline of populations, vital statistics, and how they change over time. So we look at things like life tables. Here's an example of one here for the ground squirrels. Excuse me. So you have your males and your females. So that gives you your sex ratio, right? You've got the number of deaths, which also have death rate, life expectancy, the numbers of individuals at each age. So why do teenage boys pay high car insurance rates? That could be something that could be studied in demography. One of the ways we can show things like this, growth patterns, is by looking at survivorship curves. It's a graphic representation of a life table. So in this case, you have a relatively straight line that basically has a constant death rate. Males have a lower survival rate than females in this case, but the chance of dying at any particular age is pretty much the same in this ground squirrel population. So age structures, we look at age pyramids is what we call these diagrams, and they can tell us a little bit about what the population is doing currently, but also they can tell us about what could happen in the future. So in countries developing countries like Kenya, we have a very broad base, lots of individuals in the pre-reproductive state, and not very many in the post-reproductive state. So these populations are probably going to grow pretty rapidly as those pre-reproductive individuals move into the reproductive phase. Slow growth, it's fairly constant until you get into the older ages, and then the numbers obviously decrease as you get older. But again, you've got some individuals that reproductive state where they're still kind of growing slowly. And then zero growth or a decrease like Italy, you have a much more narrow base. And so there's fewer individuals to replace those that are dying off. So this is kind of the key part of the graphs that you want to look at when you're doing predictions. Okay. There's our reproductive in the green, or reproductive in the red, pre-reproductive in the green, and then the post-reproductive. So survivorship curves come in one of 3 types. There's type 1, type 2, and type 3. So what do they tell us? So type 1, high death rate in the post-reproductive years. So these are typical for large animals that have lots of parental care of offspring. So most individuals survive until they get to that post-reproductive age, and then as old age sets in, they start to die off. Type 2, constant mortality through lifespan, like a hydra, which is a type of cnidarian, if you don't remember. Pretty much equal chance of dying at any point. And then type 3 have very high early mortality, but the ones that do survive through to adulthood, they tend to live out most of their lifespan. So basically, type 1, they don't have a lot of offspring. They typically delay offspring till later in life, and they have more parental care. Type 3 reproduce early, have lots and lots of offspring, but little parental care, hoping that some survive. So there's got to be some trade-offs in survival and reproduction, right? What is the cost of reproduction? There's a certain amount of energy that has to go into reproduction. And do you want to put it into producing gametes or put it into caring for offspring? That's kind of the trade-off there. Increased reproduction may decrease survival. Trout, they put all their energy into reproducing and then they die. Things that affect this are, what is the age at first reproduction? And what is the investment per offspring? And how many reproductive cycles do they go through in their lifetime? Natural selection favors a life history that maximizes lifetime reproductive success. And again, that's going to be different for different kinds of living things. So there's also this idea of parental survival. Okay. Parents survive the following winter. They tend to have, there's a cost of large broods for both male and female parents in things like the kestrel falcons. If they have a lot of offspring, typically not as many parents survive and have babies the next generation. So there's two kinds of reproductive strategies. Where are you going to put your energy? K-selected and R-selected. K-selected tend to have late reproduction, few offspring, lots of energy invested in raising the offspring. So most of the offspring survive. So they have a type 1 survivorship curve. Primates, coconut plants would be examples. R-selected, early reproduction, many offspring, little parental care. Those are your type 3 survivorship curves. Insects, many plants use that kind of thing. So what are the trade-offs? Again, you have a limited amount of energy, so the number and size of the offspring versus survival of the offspring or the parent. Those are the trade-offs. So R selected, lots of weeds. K selected, like the coconut here. And again, just to remind you, here's our survivorship curves. K selected type 1, R selected type 3 typically.